India is a land of contradictions. With rapid modernization and a bustling economy, this country continues to produce billionaires every year. But it's also home to a third of the world's poor, with most of them surviving on only $1 a day. While India may be on its way to becoming a global superpower, this nation still struggles with illiteracy, corruption, and social inequality. Today we're in Mumbai to find out how Indians feel about their country's rapid rise and the challenges to come. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. Welcome to Mumbai and welcome to the cafe. Joining us in the cafe today are Manish Tiwari, a member of India's parliament from the ruling Congress party and also the party spokesman. He represents the city of Ludhiana in the state of Punjab. Vimlendu Jha, the head of Swecha, the New Delhi We for Change Foundation. His youth group advocates for environmental protection and more transparent governance. Gayatri Shah is a Mumbai-based writer who focuses on fashion, art and lifestyle for Indian and international publications. YP Singh, a former Deputy Commissioner of the Indian Police who resigned after 20 years of service to protest corruption in the force. He was recently appointed by the International Cricket Council to be its anti-corruption chief. Anil Dhaka, one of India's best-known columnists. He has been the editor of several of the country's newspapers and magazines. Rizvi Syed is a human rights campaigner and poet. And Neera Chandhok, a political scientist and director of the Developing Countries Research Centre at the University of Delhi. Welcome to the cafe and thank you everybody for joining us today. Now, India is touted as the next major big superpower. Let's just start with you. Is it really? Is it ready to be the next big superpower?
I think there's a need to question these concepts per se. What does a superpower or what does a hyperpower really mean? Is it the ability to influence events and people outside your own territorial domain, and then in the manner in which you choose to do it? Insofar as India is concerned, I think what we are really seeing over the next 2 decades is space for consolidation. India is an emerging power. It has arrived on the global scene, but we need to consolidate over the next 2 decades, sort out our internal contradiction, and India's time will really come in 2030 when the generation of the little emperors starts aging and India's demographic dividend starts to kick in.
Anil, would you agree that India is on its way to becoming a major superpower?
No, I don't agree. For the simple reason that I think India is already a superpower.
Already is a superpower, you say?
And has been. Because
but what makes a superpower?
I will add to what...
Let me just ask, what makes India a superpower?
I will add to what Manish Tiwari was saying, that there are a lot of parameters by which you define it. But I would say that if you keep aside military power, there's so many other things that India has always been in the forefront of. Going back to Jawaharlal Nehru's days, when the non-alignment movement started, it was a completely new concept which was brought into the world. So you had the West and the East as enemies, but here was a middle path. Now, if that is not leadership, what is? Then we are the second most populous country in the world. It's a very young population. It's growing at a phenomenal rate. No other country except China can match it. Spiritually, we've always given a lot to the world. We are giving a lot to the world in terms of culture and arts. We've been doing that for quite a number of years. So you start defining it in these broad parameters, and we're already there.
Neera, would you agree that India has arrived as a superpower? It's a major player on the international stage?
Well, the famous Goldman Sachs report said India was an emerging power. Now, from emerging to superpower, there are too many steps to be taken. But seriously, I think India's claim to superpowerhood status is going to be compromised by two factors. One is the regional situation. I cannot think of a single superpower in history which has not hegemonized the region. And India is caught up in regional conflicts. I mean, I think we have conflict with most of our neighbors. The second impediment, and a very serious one, that India has to negotiate, I cannot think of a single country laying claim to superpower status that did not deal with social problems before economic growth. Now, we have reversed the order. We have economic growth based upon a very narrow kind of a source of outsourcing and services without carrying out any kind of a social economic transformation. That means how can you claim to be a superpower when you're regularly indicted by international organizations, largest number of malnourished children in India. India has the largest number of anemic women. India is poor. There's a big debate, but everybody agrees 1/3 of our people live below poverty. And if you go by slightly more, then it comes to 70%. Now, all these, every time you say, we want a seat on the Security Council, people say, hello, you couldn't solve your own problems, your regional problems. So, let's be realistic and look at various dimensions of superpower status.
Well, a small intervention. When Britain was a superpower, there was a lot of inequality there. You had immense poverty in Britain. You had the aristocracy, you had a middle class, but there was that lower working class, which was in a terrible state. So it does not necessarily mean that everything should be brilliant in your country before you become a superpower. There are various definitions.
The fact of the matter is that India contributes 2.1% to the world's GDP. That is an insignificant number, frankly. So if you define it in economic parameters, I don't think we're anywhere near economic superpower status. Domestic consumption is driving the growth that you were talking about, the 8.5% or whatever. We have 9.5% inflation, and food inflation is probably in the double digits. So, I mean, yes, you're right, in the soft power sense, the cultural space, the religious space, the spiritual space, we've had a lot to contribute and continue to contribute. And in some senses, we try to act like the moral voice of the world. We may not always succeed. But I think to come back to Manisha's points, I think we've got 20 more years. We're 20 years into the game. I think we maybe have another 20 years to see how we can put our house in order.
Brisby, would you agree that there is still more time that's needed before India actually arrives?
20 years ago, we had similar myth that there is economic development going to happen and India is going to become a superpower and there will be a lot of development. And we have seen the kind of development which has happened. Few people have become rich, a lot of people have become poorer. Tribal areas have been invaded by the business mafias and innocent people are being killed. Just 2-3 days back, farmers are killed in Pune and they only wanted water for their village. So I just see a country which is killing its own people and which is growing in that direction cannot become a superpower. We are not responsible neighbors. We allowed massacre happening in front of us in Sri Lanka and we didn't intervene. And I feel right now the world has become a kind of place where people have compromised and there's a deal like I don't talk about the atrocities in your country, you don't talk about our country. And that is how we are playing. And if this is called superpower, I don't know. But in Indian context, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh is superior thing. You have to be creator, you have to be sustainer, and you have to be a destructor. So right now we are only destructor.
Why do you apply different standards to India from other countries?
Yeah, right.
Why do you do that? I mean, why are we so defensive about our country? All right, things are not perfect.
Yeah.
There never will be. There are a lot of things that are wrong. We know there's social inequality. There's going to be turmoil because of that. But when it comes to kind of real politics, now you've had the USA, for example, which is indisputably a superpower, having to compromise with other countries. You can't lay down the moral law for everyone, including your neighbors. How can you do that? India cannot say to Sri Lanka, you better behave, otherwise we'll do this. We have no right to interfere.
We don't have right because we are doing the same thing here.
It's not, that's not the point. You were raising that as an objection to India being a superpower. Now, America has had a relationship with the worst dictatorships.
But what Rizvi is actually saying that, when you look at to be a superpower, one is to be a superpower to the rest of the world in terms of your military and economic acumen, and the other is to be really some kind of a power to your own people, and perhaps we have actually failed there. Because if you look at all the indicators, and that's exactly what you were talking about and what you also suggested, that indicators are really, really terrible, as in they're not even average. These are below average indicators that we're talking about, and of course we claim, as in in terms of economic growth, there are certain statistics that we have that we boast about, and which say that yes, India is actually growing, India has grown, India has arrived. But India has arrived how and for who? Because we are only in last 20 years, we've actually seen very few people become very, very rich, and most of the people be completely deprived of this race. So I think there's a problem there.
Has our middle class not grown?
They have, but what composes middle
class?
Middle class
what
therefore
always drives the country.
Absolutely
always.
Correct. But middle class is the happiest class, therefore, because it serves this economic model serves the middle class. Middle class is happy consuming.
No, I would argue that the middle class is extremely fed up.
Also, exactly. So that's could be.
Fed up
I
of
think
what
you're
though?
overstating the number of people who benefited. There were headlines last year, India's dollar millionaires go up by 50%. If you take account, there are only $1,200 millionaires in India, which is not a large number for such a population. At the same time, the Human Development Report of 2010 told you that 8 of your states contain 231 million absolute poor, which are more than 26 poorest countries in Africa. So, both ways, I do not think we can claim.
Yeah, and what is like glory? People getting billionaires or people committing farmer suicides?
No, I'm not.
So,
I have
exactly.
I'm not making a case that more people should become millionaires. What I'm saying is that when we talk about how this system has benefited, it hasn't benefited people all that much, because just 1,200 dollar millionaires is not a great
And an economy
number.
doesn't work only on millionaires. We're
Allow
talking
me to
about
come in
people.
for a moment.
I agree with
I
you.
think I think we're losing the context and the perspective somewhere. Self-flagellation is a favorite sport in this country, and we love to indulge in it with a passion. And I think the diversity of our democracy allows us that liberty to indulge in it as much as we like. But look at it from a different perspective. 64 years, the Indian democracy has consolidated. If you look at the 5 big parameters on which you assess any model of governance, that is political stability, economic development, international relations, social cohesion, and social cohesion, and generally the overall well-being of the people. I think, yes, we have problems. I don't think anybody can run away from the fact that we have problems, but let's also not forget that we are a billion people. We are not Singapore, or we are not some small little country somewhere. So therefore, as we go along, we try and surmount those problems. But I think, notwithstanding that, the Indian state has had the ability to imbibe and assimilate 1 million mutinies and still continue almost completely untrammeled in its original form. And I think that's something which we really need to be proud of, which we need to celebrate. About superpower, hyperpower, I don't think we should get bogged down by labels. But yes, India is punching to its weight. And allow me to just make one quick point. Security Council, I do not know as to how much the power balance of 1945 is still relevant today. A seat on the Security Council may be something, which we sort of talk about. But are we really aspirational about it when the whole world has really moved into a G20 format? I don't think so. So I think let's be a little more realistic in our conversation. And understand that, yes, India has a problem, but we have the ability, and we've demonstrated the ability to be able to deal with it.
Just one minor correction. I would reject the idea of self-flagellation. I think it is the task of every responsible person who calls himself or herself an intellectual to critically engage with our country. I am not denying the Indian government today has put enormous sums of money for social policy, and you still have large numbers of people who are poor. No, may I just finish? Our army is holding 1/3 of the country together. These are political wars. These are not military wars. The political will to come to terms with either Manipur, Iram, Sharmila, or Kashmir, or the Maoists doesn't seem to be there. Everybody seems to think of it as a law and order problem, which it is not. I mean, it is a political problem.
I will give you, 3 examples which demonstrate absolutely the opposite. In Punjab, we had insurgency or terrorism for 15 years. We had a law and order solution to it. In Mizoram, there was a problem over all these years. We had a political solution to it. In Assam, the students who were out on the streets in 1985 from the hostel straight away went to the Chief Minister's house. And I can give you various examples, chapter and verse, as to how the Indian state has dealt with different problems in different manner. Therefore, insofar as Kashmir is concerned also, let me also point out that in Jammu and Kashmir, there have been 3 democratic elections labeled fair and free by international observers from 1996 till today. The people who raised the bogey of Jammu and Kashmir, can they say the same thing about Pakistan-occupied Kashmir? Can they say the same thing about the northern areas?
I have been listening.
I don't think it's a discussion.
Now, I have been listening for quite some time to all of you, and I was absolutely quiet. Better take the opinions of others, everyone, and then try to reconcile with my own perception about the things at stake. I think few examples if you cite in a country of about 1200 million people, there would always be some law and order problems, some people would be dying, but that doesn't really prove the rule. You have to see the aggregate, and if we see the number of people getting killed in communal riots and in law and order problems, maybe 50 years back, I think now it is just a minuscule. Not even 10% of the people would be getting killed today by the cops as it used to be maybe 40 years before, 50 years before. Now, for the country to be a superpower, what is required is that we have to be an economic superpower in today's context, because being militarily powerful won't really be relevant. And if we are an economic superpower, as a collateral, we would be certainly militarily powerful. Now, this nation has about 16 to 70% of the world's population. Our contribution to the overall gross product for the world is just 2%. Now, this is not a healthy situation at all. We are earlier, during the initial 40 years of our independence, we were going, it used to be called a Hindu rate of growth, 3.5%. Now we are roughly, for the past 10, 12 years, we are hovering around 8%. Now, if the country to develop, we require a double-digit growth, that is about 12%, and this is nowhere coming by. So, at least in the immediate future, I don't think that the country is going to be a superpower, but certainly maybe in the long run.
Can I just take you up on that?
Yes.
Let's look around the world. What is happening around the world? The United States of America, $14 trillion economy, $14 trillion in debt. Eurozone almost collapsing. Africa not yet emerged. The Asian tigers having peaked. China going through a whole internal turmoil. So therefore, if there's any happening story in the world, notwithstanding all the self-flagellation, it is only the India story. It is only the India story.
I ask one question. What should be India's economic rate of growth? To be a superpower. Now answer to this question.
Well, let me tell you. I do not subscribe to the concept of superpower or hyperpower. I think these are outdated labels and terminologies. Let's not get into it. I think what is important in India's context is how do we distribute that wealth? You see, the economic liberalization model that we adopted in 1991, which entered its third decade in July this year, I think now we have moved to a paradigm whereby we have to see how do we try and equitably distribute that wealth, and that's why over the past 5 years, and I'm not speaking as the UPA spokesperson or something, we've actually put in place a set of rights, a set of legally actionable rights, information, education, right to food. So therefore, it is the redistribution of all this wealth which is going to
Why we are not touching 12% mark?
You will touch 12% also. If you actually put the black and the white economy together, you actually may be at 15%.
And can I just get...
You are accepting the fact there's a big black
Of course there
economy.
is. Nobody runs away from that.
Gayatri's point of view here.
I'm married to someone who is in business in India, and we can formulate all the laws we want to formulate, and we're very good at doing that, and on paper everything looks perfect. And yes, you're right, given the way the world is, India looks attractive, but the fact of the matter is, to do business, the ground reality is still a nightmare. I think just the other day in the paper, one of our business titans came out and said, we're going back to the days of the license Raj. If you try to get a file moving from one desk to the other, it takes inordinate amount of time. It is extremely inefficient. The system continues to be extremely inefficient, and this is not an attack on politicians. This is the way the bureaucracy is now functioning 64 years down the... Yes, exactly. Governance in India today is, I mean, we're functioning, we are growing despite the government. You know, if you talk to any entrepreneur, they are functioning basically by riding the seat, you know, they're riding through the seat of their pants. It's very, very difficult. It is true.
And I'll give you concrete examples of that. Look at the states which are growing in India. You know, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra, even Gujarat for that matter, and some of the other coastal states. You know, they of course have a locational advantage because geographically they are on the coast. But some of these states, especially the southern states, have reformed their governance structures, and that is why you have business which has gravitated towards them. So therefore, you see, no business can grow in isolation. You know, if somebody thinks that because, you know, he's a corporate czar, you know, he can contribute without an enabling environment, it doesn't happen in real life. Fact is that we've had governance reforms in certain states. Those states where we've had governance reforms have performed better, and those haven't have lagged behind. And that's why we are trying to catch up. Bihar, we don't rule Bihar, but it's a classical example where good governance got Nitish Kumar back for the second time.
I think law and order has broken down in the realm of corruption. In body offences, it's perfect. We don't have violence. But when it comes to corruption, any bureaucrat, any minister does it with an enormous sense of impunity.
That have had reform, the kinds of reforms you are talking about, even there you are paying bribes. Even there to get a file
She's right to that
moving.
extent.
Well, let me take you up on this bribe bit. Let me take you up on the bribe bit. You know, we've had this whole bogey of corruption which has invaded the discourse over the last 1 year. I want to ask one fundamental question. What is the responsibility of the citizen? Why does the citizen not refuse to pay? Why don't all of us who sit around this table, take a pledge? We will not pay. And if that becomes the movement, that is really going to fundamentally alter everything.
Impractical idealism.
It is not idealism. That is the way it happens.
This is not possible. We have to be practical. We have to be pragmatic.
You don't get your land
In 1906, when Gandhi came back from South Africa, independence did not look achievable. Everybody said it is an ideal. It happened in the course of 40 years. So therefore, I think we need to start right here and now.
The example you were giving of private sector growing much faster in spite of the government is shown typically in the IT field. IT grew so fast that the government was not able to do anything about it. It grew in spite of the government. So the corruption factor didn't come in at all. The bureaucracy didn't come in. So we have to somehow get over this, and I think it will happen when we make examples of big people going to jail, like we've had this 2G scam and the Commonwealth Games and a few other cases. Suddenly, ministers are going to jail. Now, this can become frightening. The laws have always been there. If we make examples and people go to jail, suddenly the fear of the law will come in. And I think the only thing that can stop corruption is fear of the law.
I'm just going to stop you there. We will come back to the issue of corruption. We're going to take a very short break now. Stay with the cafe. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the cafe. We are in Mumbai, where we're talking about India's prospects on the global arena. Now, just before the break, we were talking about corruption. YP, you are trying to fight corruption here in India. Just how bad is the situation?
I think corruption is going from bad to worse because earlier people had a fear and they had the values. When the country became independent, Gandhian values were suffused all over. But now what is happening with the passage of time, the laws they suffer from the vice of non-implementation. The rule of law in the realm of corruption has totally shattered if you see the wealth of the people at the helm of affairs, that's enormous, unthinkable. There's a massive black money which has got generated because of the corruption factors. Maybe that's leading to economic growth, but that is also leading to economic imperfections where the economic forces are not operating the way they should. It's really terrible. Not a single guy till today has been sent to jail after conviction on account of corruption. They all are in jail at the moment during a pre-trial phase. I think this is something very serious which is affecting India's economic development, and that is going to constrain India becoming a superpower.
I know you were saying.
Even in China,
Yeah.
where the penalty for corruption is execution. Even there is corruption. You know, even though the penalty is so high. So I suppose it's part of human nature to try and make money when you can.
But the incidence of corruption has to come
No,
down.
the incidence of corruption in this country is immense. And as
Well, let me
all of us
then
know,
ask you, but is it an issue, is it a systemic problem or is it a cultural problem? The issue of
I
corruption
don't know about
in India?
culture. It's certainly a systemic problem, because what happens is that you have people who have the power to grant something. Now, when you have that power, you can make money on it. There are people who can give you permissions. They can make money on that.
I think a small
Vimlendra,
point.
no, can I just let Vimlendra here and say,
Previous point that Manish had made, that we have why do people pay the bribe, as in why do we have to be corrupt? My problem is that you're actually looking at fixing 1 billion people and not fixing 500 odd people, not take responsibility at that helm, because most of the corruption is primarily driven from seat of power, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are powerful are more corrupt because they actually create a culture of corruption. Now, the other thing in terms of when we look at whether it's a cultural thing or it's a systemic thing, right now, don't look at individual cases. There are, of course, these instances of corruption where we're looking at individuals being corrupt. We're looking at how we have, at one point we were actually looking at corruption was bad, corruption was illegal. We are looking at in the last 20 years, we're looking at how corruption or illegal form of things have actually been legalized. So most of the form of bad governance that we talk about, or corruption that we're talking about, has actually been adapted to really serve the corporates, as in corporates primarily are...
Could I just say, someone was mentioning about you need to catch the big fish so that the little fish can actually... How many parliamentarians are facing charges of corruption?
Well, ultimately, let me tell you, you cannot reverse jurisprudence on its head. Nobody is guilty, everybody is innocent until proven guilty, and that is what the Indian jurisprudence is.
How many parliamentarians are facing
therefore, facing charges at the end of the day, I don't think is the correct index of whether you have corrupt public representatives or not. I think the litmus test is that ultimately you have a fair judicial system. How many people who go through that judicial system ultimately get convicted? And you've had cases like Mr. Sukram, our former communications minister, who's been convicted. You've had other cases.
Why is it so, when we say corruption just has been happening, why is it so that the state or the government is always caught by surprise when it comes to corruption? Like you're not aware of these big corruptions that we're talking about that actually has affected our GDP. Most of the time, you're not aware of it, and therefore
they're not caught by surprise. They're
they are surprised. They're basically
No.
they're
know it's
cornered,
there.
and because they're part of it in many ways.
The surprise is that it comes out in the public domain.
That's right. So
Well, I worked in anti-corruption agencies. Now, one small thing. I have worked in anti-corruption agencies for a very long period of time. Now, there is one sure, short way to catch a corrupt guy, is that when you go and pay the money, let him be trapped. This is a foolproof case and never corruption happens. But then, if a businessman, if you are a businessman and you are complaining that they demand money, why, as a citizen, you don't complain to the Central Bureau of Investigation or to the Anti-Corruption Bureau to get him trapped red-handed? The problem is with us citizens, because we complain of corruption, but we don't fight corruption.
Can I just, Neera, is the problem with the citizens? People are not reporting
There's
it?
levity. But you look at the body language, because we're talking about making examples of people who are corrupt at the top. You look at their body language when they are arrested. They behave as if they were freedom fighters going to jail during the colonial period. I mean, the Chief Minister of Karnataka, 1 minute, let me finish, Mr. Singh. I listen to you with respect. You please listen to others with respect. I mean, he goes in a procession doing this. The man has been accused of embezzling vast sums of money. And he has followers with him. He gets his own person appointed as the next chief minister. Where does this whole idea, we make examples, we hang them in the street square till by the neck till they die, and corruption will be wiped out. Today the people who are the most corrupt act like as if they are fighting for the country, as if they are Bhagat Singh or somebody.
and
Their
they are
body
shameless.
language is
Yeah,
shameful.
shameless.
I
They
mean,
said corrupt is the one who is caught.
I
Manish.
think we can go on a complete tangent on this, but I think what is really happening today is that in addition to corruption in government, the corporate corruption is also coming out in a big way. And that's why, you have the other side of the coin equally, behind bars. And I think this cleanup process in corporate India and in administrative India is something which is going to rejuvenate us. And I don't think we need to be defensive about it.
We are in the robber baron, the gilded age of the Indian economy. 20 years in, there is no doubt there's been collusion at the top levels. I mean, we've got 55 billionaires in this country whose wealth, net wealth, is equivalent to 20% of the GDP. So, and that they didn't just come out of nowhere. Some of them might have, been able to do it perhaps in the IT sector where a lot of that growth was export driven. But most of it has happened hand in hand. It's collusion. And if you look at, the assets of our politicians, which is now declared, we don't know how accurate or not it is. I'm sure that's the case. We've got, politicians who drive around in BMW 7 Series. There's, like you said, it's brazen. They're wearing very fancy watches. The former chief minister of Karnataka was holidaying in Mauritius and, was going to come back and then deal with, there's no there's no kind of bandwidth. And as a private citizen, if you're working in a company, you can't behave like that. You can't be on vacation if your job is on the line. Yeah. So this is what, there's a big disconnect.
It begs the question. I just wanted to ask her a question.
If politicians are making so much money, whether legally or illegally, why do you mind if they enjoy it? Let them enjoy it.
I'll ask you
Let them wear watches, let them drive big
It begs
cars.
an answer. You rightly said that we are possibly in the gilded age of India's economy. So therefore, don't you think one of the solutions to that is a very robust antitrust legislation which can really break the power of the corporates and stop their pernicious
Does it
influence,
exist?
interference in the political processes. And that's the reason I'm saying.
The government has handed over the rural sector to the private sector. The private sector is now investing in the countries of Africa, arousing a lot of antagonism. The government has made the private sector an integral part of governance. This should have been thought of, controlling the power of corporate capital before the corporate capital was brought in.
So the thing is, all over the world, reform and legislation has always come when things have reached a certain critical mass. You legislate too early, you regulate too early, you kill the baby in the womb. So therefore, I think the stage has come whereby we possibly need to legislate at the moment.
But I have a problem with what you're saying, because when you have this regulatory mechanism which you're talking of, which on one hand is necessary, but once it happens and it becomes powerful, that's going to become a source of corruption. Well, how are you going to stop that?
I'll go back to YP's point.
Let me finish my point.
Let
me finish my point. The Lokpal, for example, everyone's talking of the Lokpal. Now, when the Lokpal becomes all powerful.
Sorry, can you just, for the international audience, if you could just explain to us the Lokpal bill?
Well, the Lokpal bill is what is being agitated about now, which will bring public officers, and they're saying even the Prime Minister, the judiciary, should be investigated for corruption. What I'm saying is that once you get this whole Lokpal, the whole mechanism, it'll become another bureaucracy.
Of all the countries in India and Africa and the other countries which got liberated from the yoke of imperialism and colonialism, India possibly is the only country which has maintained an unbroken tradition of democracy. There is a legitimate fear that let us not create an institution which becomes a Frankenstein, which ultimately, totally corrodes the balance of power, which underscores the essence of Indian democracy.
Are you suggesting that this bill will actually erode power?
Yes. And I'm telling you why. There is a fear that we are still a fledgling democracy. It is consolidating itself. Let us not create institutions which can become bigger than the Indian state itself.
Nero, you were saying?
Yeah, you see, it's an essential principle of democracy that there are checks and balances in the system.
Well, that's the basis of
any
democracy.
institution which concentrates power is to be resisted with suspicion. I mean, I'm not that I'm on the side of the government. I think they're making a caricature of what is called civil society, but that is another debate. I think the solution that is being proposed, see, the women's movement wanted a women's commission. Today, the Women's Commission has become a parking lot for politicians and patronage. The Human Rights Commission is more or apart, you'll know better, but more or less, you know, it is not very important when it comes to human rights. Because we have a very powerful civil liberties movement in the country, that raises issues. The Human Rights Commission is not raising those issues.
On that point, Rizvi, I want to bring you in here in terms of human rights. And in India, is India respecting human rights? And isn't that part of being a superpower?
From the beginning, I think everything is interrelated. Corruption, human rights violation, illiteracy, all these things are interrelated. And I see India after independence itself becoming a country which is like Afghanistan, warlords taking over the entire country. We have mafias running each region and they are above the law. If they massacre people, nobody can touch them. Every state has its own mafia. Within Bombay, if I want to do a film shoot, each area is divided by some Sena. And I have to pay the bribe. That bribe is a protection money, protection from the goons. Okay. So we have entire India is like that. If you want to...
I was doing a film shoot. There are guys who came and disrupted me. I lodged a complaint with Juhu police station. Those guys, Raja and company, I still can't remember. They were put behind bars for 3 days. Why they were dismissed? Because you didn't do your duty as a citizen.
See,
We have very good institutions. I don't agree with you that our human rights record is very good. Human rights is very good. Corruption record is bad. Human rights we are very good.
We are at a culture right
In police, I have been in police. Earlier, if there would be 100
That's
hours.
a very interesting point you just raised.
Earlier, I have
You say
worked
that
in the
human
police. I have
rights-
seen those days. When I joined the police in 1985, if in a police station, maybe in a day, people were being given 100 slaps. Today, not more than 10 slaps are being given.
Indicators are very, very
So
soft.
we have
That's
no
an improvement.
No.
That's an improvement.
That's an
No, it's an
interesting
enormous improvement,
benchmark.
90%. Now any cop,
90% reduction.
Can we just let
A lot
Reggie
of things
speak?
could be attributed to governance and corruption, but if you say that our human rights, as in terms of we've scored better, in last 10 years, you've seen Gujarat, you've seen Naxal fights, you're seeing land grabs here and there. Right to live has been denied to people.
Tell me
Not just that.
tell me
Wait,
aggregate
I
figures.
don't want to get into statistics because
Statistics
let's
is
not get into
important
that.
here.
It's on our face.
Tell
You
me
don't
how
have to-
many people were getting killed in 2000 and how many in
2,000
2011?
Muslims in Gujarat, 2002.
Yes, and
See,
you'll
in,
have several
okay,
reports.
in 2000 people died. After that, how many died? You tell me this.
No, what
Our
I'm
record
sorry,
is
this is
improving.
not
Our
about
record-
trade-offs.
it's not.
First we killed 100 people, now we
And
only
not
killed
just
10
that, we are
people.
also
This is
talking
a
about one more
shocking
thing.
comment.
Look, human rights defenders are now attacked. That's the other part. One is human rights being violated, the other is human rights defenders.
No, let's get real about it. The fact is that yes, human rights activists, do have a role to play in a democratic society. But is human rights only a one-way street? Don't police officers who are fighting terrorists and whose families are killed have human rights? Why don't the human rights activists speak about that? We had 15 years of terror in Punjab. So many police officers were killed. So many police officers' families were killed. So many innocent people were killed. My father was killed. He was a member of parliament. He had no role to play, in stoking any violence. No human rights activist ever came to me and condoled his death.
How many illegal cremations did the police carry out in
Well,
Punjab?
essentially...
No, there are enough statistics.
Essentially, there was the National Human Rights Commission which then put it right. The Supreme Court of India put it right.
You
didn't have to go to
hundreds
an
of young
outside
Sikh
institution.
boys.
The point YP is making is our institutions are very, very vibrant.
Defense of the
I take
police.
recourse, access those institutions.
Manish, we are not saying that if the police, of course, it also applies to them, it applies to the army people, but it also applies to the poor people.
Can we just get Gayatri's
Indian
point?
society is still essentially feudal. That is our tradition. The way it's not just at the state level, from the way we treat our staff at home, because everyone over a certain income level has someone working at home. You think about the way you treat the person who serves you, the person who's driving you, whatever. It is the human rights, that's where it all begins, the way we treat each other. And then of course it bubbles up to the surface and goes beyond to the state level. The police, sorry to say, are able to terrorize very disenfranchised people because they know that power is vested in them. And this is essentially because we are a feudal society. as India evolves and changes, our socio-economic changes help to alleviate that feudalism, that will change too. But our inherent attitudes are not, are still evolving.
So are you seeing a time perhaps where India will at some point stand up for its more vulnerable, for its poor, for the disaffected?
As right now, life is very cheap in India. If we become like the Americans and think about every single life that is lost and actually come down on sort of working towards that, then yes.
I think we have to look at the overall picture. No one disputes that there are human rights violations. No one disputes that these violations are generally against the poor people who are the most vulnerable. We have to look at, is the picture getting better? In a country of this size, of such diversity, so many people, you have to look at the progress. And that is one. Second, you have to look at, is there a mechanism for redressal? If there are violations, can some action be taken? The third thing we have to see is there outrage at these violations? Do people get upset? Now what is happening is the media has become very vigilant. Like when you talk of the farmers who were killed in Pune, immediately every channel had the footage. Now the police who were responsible for that can't escape. So you have to look at the big picture and see where were we and where we are now and where we are going.
I have a point to make. Earlier, human rights violations were based on, say, perhaps somebody's race, somebody's identity. It was a lot identity-based human rights violation. Right now, it's money-based, it's class-based, it's resource-based violations that's actually happening.
Again, I think I need to pick a point there. While I entirely agree with you that possibly would be the most appropriate thing to displace as less people as possible. But the reality, unfortunately, is that if you are going to talk about a 10 or a 12% growth rate of GDP, those growth numbers have to come out of somewhere. And unfortunately, India's minerals, India's mineral wealth, ultimately the mineral wealth of India is not in Mumbai. It is not that, you need to demolish skyscrapers. The reality is that India's mineral wealth is, unfortunately, it's in its forest. It's unfortunately in Odisha. So therefore, you need to be extremely sensitive. You need to be extremely sensitive about it. You need to be extremely sensitive about it. But this balance between development and the ecology needs to be maintained. I don't think we can become environmental fundamentalists.
No, let me ask a question. Since he's taken it upon himself to defend the Indian government or the UPA, let me ask you two simple questions. Development for whom?
And at what cost?
At what cost? You see, there are people you're dealing with who are extremely vulnerable, right? Who are used to living in a certain way. You are picking them up and throwing, and India has 94% workers in the unorganized sector. You're throwing them into this informal economy with some nod to social protection, which will get hijacked on the way. You're depriving them of their land, their water, their forest. They pick tendo leaves, you're driving them out, throwing them on the informal economy.
You asked a question.
With complete exploitation. And then you justify it in the name of development. I mean, we all have to ask.
Manish, I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to stop you there. And we are going to have to wrap up the discussion. I realize it's a very robust discussion and there's a lot of things we do need to cover. But just going back to the initial question, and please, if you could try and keep your answers short, do you think India is on its way, or will India become a superpower?
Well, the saying is, rising India, sinking Indians. That comes sometime.
YP.
With 16% of population and 2% of GDP, and the growth rate still not up to the mark, India won't become a superpower in the immediate future.
Anil?
Yes, we are a superpower already.
I like that. Nice and short. Rizvi, will India become a superpower or not?
No. But one nice thing which I'm saying, which is globally nice thing, is social network is uniting the world. Interaction is increasing. Jasmine revolution is happening because of the interaction, and we will, in that way, will be connected and we'll be part of a global system.
Gayatri.
Yes, I do think we are on our way. I think that there is a palpable energy. I mean, I live in the city of Bombay, so maybe my perspective is a bit skewed, but you know, we are living through transformative times in our country's history. We have a grand experiment. We are the world's largest democracy. We have 500 million people under the age of 25, and if we can harness that energy and put it to the right use through good governance, of course, and through growth in the economy, job generation, etc., then we will definitely be there.
Vimlendu, are you just as optimistic?
No, not at all. I think we are going through a very, very difficult phase, and which is a make or break phase in terms of if our governance changes. Of course, there's some light that we can see. I see India more like a super bully than a superpower. Super bully to its neighbors in some way that it would emerge as, and super bully to the powerless and wealthless people of the country. So I am hopeless in many, many ways.
Manish?
Well, India's problems are not with the world. India's problems are really with it. But we are the only happening story in the world. And I think, notwithstanding all the naysayers, if we can just keep the story happening, there is nothing which is going to stop us from arriving at our destination if we have not already arrived.
Thank you very much for all your points of view. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us in the cafe. We've had some amazing conversations over the last few weeks. If you have any comments, do email us at thecafe@aljazeera.net. Thank you again for joining us in the cafe.
The original question was whether India is a superpower or on its way to becoming that. We sort of got, we gravitated towards very pressing issues like corruption and human rights. I think because those, especially the corruption issue, is very real right now in India because of that bill that we were talking about, which is placed in front of Parliament. So perhaps we digressed a bit.
It was a very fascinating discussion, a very nice exchange of views, and I think that is what celebrates the diversity of India as we enter the 64th year of our independence, that discussions in India and the discourse has always been very free and lively.
Oh, I got my point across, I always do. But I'm used to having people who don't share my point of view. That is a democracy, and India is a very vocal democracy.
GDP doesn't represent the growth. We might show something in the stock market, we might become a very big nation, but somebody is controlling our foreign policy. As a nation, we are spineless. We don't speak about atrocities within the country, and that is why we don't talk about the outside country also. There is a compromise.
I think very interesting because we're looking at different voices. We're looking at voices that have actually profited from this growth story. So we had voices that really supported this entire growth idea, and there were people like me who were cynical and who are cynical because we think that the story is incomplete. The story is actually leading towards a different direction.
Yes, India has grown in many respects, but there are vast flaws that we need to recognize. And unless you learn to critically examine your own system, the system doesn't grow.